I never thought moving into my new house would bring so much trouble. I was just excited to have a quiet place to call my own, away from the city noise, with a peaceful neighborhood and plenty of space. It was a perfect setup. But then, I found out the hard way that sometimes, neighbors aren't always as friendly as they seem. This one particular neighbor, let's call her Karen, wasn't exactly what I had in mind when I dreamed of a good neighbor. The first time I met Karen, I thought she was just a typical older lady who was looking out for the community. I even thought it was nice when she stopped by to introduce herself. She talked about how she had lived in the area for years and how everything used to be so peaceful, how people used to follow all the rules, and how the neighborhood was tight-knit. But something about Karen seemed off. As time went on, I realized she wasn't just a nice old neighbor, she was also the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, which gave her some serious control over the neighborhood. She started showing up at my door more often, checking up on things, always asking questions about my property. At first, I thought it was just part of her job, but as the visits kept happening, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. She'd make comments about my garden, my fence, my driveway, basically anything she could. Her tone always had this air of authority, and even though I had every right to do whatever I wanted with my property, she acted like it wasn't mine at all. The real trouble started when Karen decided that my property wasn't being used properly according to the HOA's rules. This was the first time I realized just how much power she thought she had. I had a small strip of land that led to the road, not exactly a driveway, but just a pathway that had been there for years. I didn't think much of it, but she had other plans. One day, I came home to find that Karen had decided to call a few of her friends from the HOA over to inspect my land. They had a good look at it and began making suggestions about how it should be cleaned up, how I should install a gate, and that I had to make sure no one used the strip as a shortcut to get to the neighborhood. It felt so intrusive. I was just trying to enjoy my space, and here she was, telling me how I should live on my own property. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I just nodded and agreed, hoping it would all blow over. But Karen didn't stop there. A few days later, she showed up again, this time even more annoyed. She told me that she had received complaints from other neighbors that my strip of land was creating confusion, and that cars were using it to cut through to the neighborhood. I didn't even know what to say. It was my property, and I was just minding my own business. But she didn't see it that way. Karen had this idea in her head that she could control how I used my land. It became clear that she didn't like the idea of someone standing up for their own rights, and she wasn't going to let me off the hook easily. By then, I started getting worried. What if she tried to make a bigger deal out of this? What if the HOA started to fine me or force me to do something with my property that I didn't want to do? The tension was building up, and it felt like every time I turned around, Karen was lurking around, waiting for me to slip up. But the final straw came when she went too far. One morning, I was getting ready to leave for work when I noticed Karen and a few of her HOA friends standing at the edge of my property, looking at my gate and whispering among themselves. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided enough was enough. I was going to take control of the situation and stand up for my rights. What happened next, however, was something I wasn't prepared for at all. After seeing Karen and her friends huddled at the edge of my property, I could feel my blood pressure rise. This wasn't just a small disagreement anymore, it felt like she was actively trying to make my life miserable. I took a deep breath and walked outside, trying to stay calm. I asked her, "What's going on, Karen?" She turned to me with a look of complete disdain, the same look she'd had every time she wanted to remind me that she was in charge. Without missing a beat, she started talking in that condescending tone that I had come to dread. "This land is causing a lot of problems for the community," she said. "People are using it to cut through to the neighborhood, and it's a safety hazard. You need to take immediate action to stop it." I stood there in complete disbelief. How had we gone from her casually inspecting my land to her making demands that I fix something that wasn't even broken? This was my property. I was the one who paid for it, and I had every right to use it however I saw fit. But Karen wasn't having any of it. The HOA board will not tolerate this anymore, she added. If you don't do something about it, you'll regret it. That was the moment I knew I had to do something. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else dictate how I managed my own land. I knew I needed to put my foot down, so I immediately made plans to install a proper fence. It wasn't just to keep people off my land, it was to make it clear that I wasn't backing down. I called a contractor and explained my situation, telling him I needed a sturdy gate with a fence around the area. I wasn't about to just let Karen walk all over me. I also put up a few no trespassing signs, making sure there was no confusion about my property being off limits. It didn't take long for Karen to find out about the fence. Just a few days later, as I was heading home from work, I noticed her car parked right outside my gate. She was sitting in the driver's seat, honking the horn incessantly, clearly trying to get my attention. At first, I just ignored her, thinking she might get the hint and leave. But she didn't. Instead, she got out of her car, stormed up to my gate, and demanded that I open it. "I'm late, and you're blocking my way," she snapped. "Open this gate now." I was furious. Who did she think she was? I walked up to the gate, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "This is my property, Karen. You're trespassing. You can't just waltz in here whenever you feel like it." But she wasn't listening. "This is a public road. The HOA has used it for years. You don't have the right to block it," she shouted. I could see the anger in her eyes, but I wasn't about to back down. "No, Karen," I said calmly. "This is my land, and I have every right to block anyone from using it. You're trespassing, and I'm not opening this gate." That's when things took a turn I wasn't expecting. Karen pulled out her phone, dialed something, and in a matter of seconds, I could hear her speaking loudly to someone on the other end. I didn't know who she was calling, but I had a sinking feeling it was the police. Sure enough, not long after, a patrol car pulled up in front of my house. Karen walked up to the officer, explaining the situation like she was some sort of authority figure. The officer listened carefully, then turned to me and asked, "Is this a public road?" I couldn't believe it. The officer didn't know that the strip of land wasn't a public road? But I calmly explained the situation, showing him the property map and the legal papers that proved this was my private property, not some neighborhood shortcut. "No, officer," I said firmly. "This is not a public road. This is my property, and I have every right to block access to it." The officer looked at the map, nodded, and then turned back to Karen. It was clear he was siding with me. "This isn't a public road, ma'am," he told her. "You can't use this land as a shortcut anymore." Karen's face turned red with rage, and I could see her fists clenching at her sides. But there was nothing she could do. The officer gave me a sympathetic glance and told Karen that she needed to leave the area. Karen wasn't happy about it. She kept muttering under her breath, talking about how the HOA would hear about this, and how I was making a big mistake. But I didn't care anymore. She could threaten me all she wanted. I had done my research, and I was within my rights. As the officers left, I couldn't help but feel a small victory. But little did I know, this was just the beginning. The days following that confrontation were eerily quiet. No more cars cutting through my property, no more angry visits from Karen, and no more phone calls. I thought maybe she had finally accepted the fact that she wasn't going to get her way. I enjoyed the calm for a while, but I knew better than to relax too soon. Karen was persistent, and people like her don't give up easily. Then, a week later, I received a letter in the mail from the HOA. My stomach dropped as I read the words on the page. The HOA was demanding that I remove the fence and gate that I had put up to block the access road. They said that it was a community access point, and that I was violating some kind of easement. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation, and they warned me that if I didn't comply, I could face legal action. The letter was filled with so many legal terms that it almost made my head spin. But the more I read it, the angrier I got. This was my land, not theirs. I had the right to do whatever I wanted with it. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I wasn't about to let Karen and the HOA push me around. I gathered all the evidence I had, property maps, photos of the area, and even footage from my security cameras showing Karen's first meltdown when I blocked the road. I was ready for the meeting. I wasn't going to let them bully me into removing my fence. I knew the law was on my side, and I was prepared to stand my ground. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived. I drove to the HOA office, nervous but determined. When I walked into the meeting room, it felt like the entire board was against me. Karen was sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed in that familiar self-righteous posture. She had this smug look on her face, like she already knew she was going to win. I sat down at the table, trying not to show how angry I was. I could feel the tension in the room as the board president began introducing the issue. "We've had complaints from several neighbors," he said, "and this fence is blocking a public access point that has been used for years. We need to resolve this issue." Karen quickly added, "The shortcut is the most convenient way to get to the neighborhood. We've all been using it for years, and now you're causing a major inconvenience to everyone. We need this road reopened." I could feel my blood pressure rising as she spoke. This wasn't about convenience, this was about control. I waited for her to finish, and when she did, I stood up. "This is not a public road," I said firmly, trying to stay calm. "This is my property, and I have every right to block access to it. If you'd done your homework, you would know that the HOA has no jurisdiction outside of its boundaries. You cannot force me to remove this gate." I could see Karen's face turning red with anger, but I wasn't backing down. This isn't about a shortcut. This is about my rights as a property owner. For a moment, the room went silent. I could tell some of the board members were starting to rethink their stance. They had no legal grounds to back up Karen's demands. One of the board members spoke up, asking, "Are we sure this land is within our jurisdiction?" Another member added, "I don't think we can force him to do anything if it's his property." It felt like the tide was turning in my favor. But Karen wasn't about to give up that easily. She slammed her hands on the table and shouted, "This is absurd. Just because you have a piece of paper saying you own the land doesn't mean you can mess with everyone's lives. You've been causing unnecessary trouble for the whole community." Her voice was shaking with rage, but the more she protested, the more ridiculous it seemed. The other board members looked uncomfortable, and it was clear that they were starting to realize that they didn't have a leg to stand on. The board president raised his hand to calm the room. "I think we've discussed this enough for now," he said. "We'll need to review the legalities and speak with our attorney before making any further decisions. But for now, it seems that we have to respect his property rights." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like a huge victory, even though the matter wasn't completely settled. Karen wasn't done yet, though. I could see the anger in her eyes as she stood up and stormed out of the room, muttering about how she would take this to higher authorities. But at that moment, I knew I had won. The HOA was backing down, and I was no longer going to be intimidated. For the next few weeks, the situation settled down. I didn't hear anything from Karen or the HOA. No more letters, no more complaints, and most importantly, no one was trying to drive through my property. It seemed like Karen had finally accepted the fact that I wasn't going to let her or the HOA bully me into removing my gate. But I knew better than to get too comfortable. Karen was the type of person who wouldn't just let things go quietly. I had a feeling this wasn't over, and I was right. One day, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was even more aggressive than the last. They insisted that I needed to restore public access to the road and that I should remove the gate or face further legal action. The letter was filled with threats and legal jargon that made my head spin, but I wasn't scared. I had already done my homework, and I knew they had no case. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't about to back down now. But I wasn't going to take any chances. I decided it was time to get professional help. I reached out to a lawyer to make sure I was fully protected. I explained the entire situation to him, and he assured me that I was in the right. The HOA had no legal grounds to force me to remove the gate. They couldn't control my private property, no matter how long the road had been used as a shortcut. The lawyer also suggested that I document everything, every letter, every conversation, every interaction with Karen and the HOA, so that if it did escalate further, I'd be prepared. I took his advice seriously and started keeping a detailed record of everything. I also made sure to keep an eye on my security cameras, just in case Karen or someone from the HOA tried to pull anything sneaky. And then, just as I suspected, Karen showed up again. This time, it was even more intense. I was getting ready to leave for work when I noticed her car parked in front of my gate. She was standing there, waving her arms frantically, trying to get my attention. At first, I thought it was just another attempt to get me to open the gate, but this time, I had a feeling something was different. I walked outside, prepared for whatever she was going to throw at me. Karen didn't waste any time. "I've had enough of this," she screamed. "I've been talking to my lawyer, and we're going to take you to court. The HOA has authorized this road as a public access point, and you've violated a community easement by blocking it. You're going to pay for this." I couldn't believe it. Karen had gone from threatening me with the HOA to taking legal action. But I wasn't intimidated. I calmly told her, "Karen, you're wasting your time. The HOA doesn't control this property, and you don't have any legal grounds to make me remove this gate. I've already consulted with my lawyer, and you're not going to win this." Karen's face turned bright red with anger, but she wasn't ready to back down either. She took out her phone, dialed something, and before I knew it, she had called the police again. I knew exactly what was going to happen. I'd been through this before. The police arrived shortly after Karen made her call, and the officer walked up to me. "We got a call about someone blocking a road," he said, looking at the gate. I explained the situation to him again, showing him the property map and the legal paperwork that proved this was my land and not a public road. The officer nodded, clearly understanding the situation. "This isn't a public road," he said. "You're within your rights to block access to it. We're just going to have a chat with her." I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It was clear that the officer had my back. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't happy about it. She argued with the officer, shouting about how she was going to take this to court and how I was making a huge mistake. But in the end, the officer came back to me and told me I was free to continue blocking the road. "She's been misinformed," he said. "You're in the clear." The next day, I received yet another letter from Karen, this time with more threats. She was trying to intimidate me into taking the gate down, but I wasn't scared. I had already made it clear that I wasn't going to back down. In fact, the more she pushed, the more determined I became. At that point, I decided to take things a step further. I reached out to a local news station that specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. I explained my situation to them and sent over all the documentation I had, including the letters from the HOA, the footage from my security cameras, and the legal paperwork proving that the land was mine. To my surprise, they responded quickly and agreed to do a segment on my story. A few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, explaining how the HOA and Karen had been trying to bully me into removing my gate. I talked about how the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and how Karen had been abusing her position as HOA president. The news team was supportive, and I made sure to mention how the HOA had ignored resident concerns in the past and how their actions were clearly overstepping their bounds. When the segment aired, the response was overwhelming. People reached out to me, expressing their support and sharing their own experiences with difficult HOAs. The segment even went viral in the community, and Karen's reputation was severely damaged. A few days after the segment aired, Karen called me, but this time, she wasn't yelling or threatening me. Instead, she sounded almost apologetic. "I saw the news," she said, her voice much softer than usual. "I realize now that I overreacted. I was wrong to push you like that, and I'm sorry. It was a strange turn of events. I didn't know what to say." It was like the whole situation had flipped upside down. Karen had finally realized that she had crossed a line. Not long after that, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't filled with threats. Instead, it was an apology for their involvement in the whole mess. They confirmed that they would no longer pursue any action against me and that they would remind the residents to respect private property rights. The letter also mentioned that Karen had been advised to step down from her position as HOA president. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a huge victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt bullied by an HOA. From that day forward, the HOA left me alone. Karen was nowhere to be seen, and my property was finally safe. In the months that followed, things went back to normal. No more visits from Karen, no more letters from the HOA, and the road to my property remained blocked as it should have been from the start. It was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe easy again. The peace I had longed for when I first moved in was finally mine. I was able to enjoy my property without the constant stress of dealing with Karen or the HOA. But I also learned some valuable lessons through the ordeal. I learned about my rights as a property owner, about the power struggles that can arise when people try to take control of something that doesn't belong to them, and about the importance of standing up for myself. I realized that no matter how much pressure I faced, no matter how many threats were thrown my way, I had to stand my ground. This was my land, and I had every right to protect it. I also became more aware of the influence that HOAs can have over people's lives. While most people join an HOA for the benefits, like keeping the neighborhood clean and orderly, I saw firsthand how they could be abused. Karen had used her position to try and intimidate me, to bully me into doing something I didn't want to do. But in the end, her actions backfired. She wasn't able to push me around, and the support I received from the community showed me that there were people who understood what I was going through. In the weeks after the news segment aired, I continued to get messages from people who had experienced similar issues with their own HOAs. Many of them expressed how they had been too afraid to speak up or had given in to the pressure. It was comforting to know that my story had given them the courage to stand up for themselves, just as I had. As for Karen, I didn't see her much after the whole incident. Rumor had it that she was stepping down from her position as HOA president, and she was no longer the force she once was in the neighborhood. I never heard anything from her again, and I didn't really care to. Her apology had been surprising, but it didn't change the fact that she had caused a lot of unnecessary stress. Still, I was glad it was over. Looking back on the whole situation, I realized how much of a battle it had been. From the first time I noticed cars cutting across my land to the final confrontation with Karen at the HOA meeting, I had learned so much about standing up for my rights. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, but in the end, I had to trust that I was. I had fought for what was mine, and I had come out on top. Now, as I look out at the peaceful stretch of land in front of my house, I can't help but feel proud of what I accomplished. The gate is still there, keeping unwanted trespassers out, and I'm finally able to enjoy my property without fear of someone trying to take it from me. I know that Karen and the HOA learned a lesson, but more importantly, I learned a valuable one too. Sometimes, you have to fight for what's yours, no matter how big or small the battle may seem. And as for the neighbors who used to take shortcuts across my property, I still see a few of them now and then. Some of them apologized for their past behavior, while others still seem confused about why I won't let them through. But I don't mind. I've made my decision, and I stand by it. Nobody is going to take my land from me again. It's mine to protect, and protect it I will. With everything finally settled, I can finally say that I have the peace and security I always wanted. No more HOA drama, no more threats, no more Karen trying to control my life. Just the way I like it, quiet, peaceful, and entirely my own.